In our last two segments, we've explored some of the differences between Level 1, Level 2, and Level 3 techniques of leadership. Level 1 techniques were those that intend to influence people's behavior and include rewards and punishments. Level 2 techniques tend to influence the way people think and include data, statistics, analysis, evidence, the scientific method. Level 3 techniques intend to influence the way people believe and assume that the way the world works, and include things like clarity of vision, clarity of purpose, the use of music and symbols in order to touch people in their hearts and not just in their heads. I'd like to explore this notion of Level 3 influence a little further now by inviting you to consider a situation that involves where you are and where you might want to go. So if you'll consider what I will call a simple time cone. So here we have the day you were born, and here we have the day you will die, and here we are on today's date. Now today is the narrowest part because it's the least open to interpretation. Looking back, we can reinterpret the past and get many different stories out of it, as we've described in the life story exercise. And looking forward, there are many possibilities. Who knows where we're going? So the future is also conical in shape. But for the moment, let me ask you to spend a moment and think about the future. And write down on a piece of paper, please, the names of all of the organizations in a reasonable scenario that you might be called on to lead. Now, I say a reasonable scenario. A student once said, England. I said, okay. Are you a member of the House of Windsor? No. Okay, well, this is probably not going to happen. On the other hand, I had another student once say Peru. And it turns out that his father was the Minister of Finance, and he fully expected one day to be the president of the country of Peru. So I don't know what your particular expectations are, but let me ask you to write down now on a piece of paper, pause the program, and list all of the organizations in a reasonable scenario that you might be called on to lead. And write them down specifically. So not your current job, but the next one, and the next one, and the next one. So it will look like not your leadership resume, but your leadership presume. The last one might be the social director of the Lone Pines Nursing Home or something like that, right? Take a moment, please, and write those down. Okay, have you got those written down? Now, let me ask you to look at that list and circle the ones that are not for profit and the ones that are for profit. When I do this with corporations, it's a very interesting exercise to sort out the proportionality of how many people are thinking about the next job in the organization versus something else in life. So remember, the question was the names of the organizations, I didn't specify which, that you might be called on to lead. If you separate those out, and you can see, it's kind of a projective test, you can see from inside out what your expectations are about where you're going to, you would like to or expect to spend your time and energy in leadership roles. Some of you may included family on there. You hope to someday lead your family, which of course raises the question, who's in charge now? In my family, of course, it's my wife, so I'm pretty clear about that. And I'm not sure I aspire to be in charge of that. I've led in the past a 3,000 person nonprofit organization for 8 years, so I have a lot of experience, at least, in leading large organizations, and can speak therefore from some experience, not just from my work in the university. So now I'm going to ask you to reverse your perspective, please, and think about the past And everything that you've learned from the day you were born until today. So, about being an effective leader. In other words, given your life's experience and mining your life story exercise, all the books you've read, what your parents taught you, what your teachers taught you, all the jobs, full and part-time, that you've had, as of today, what are your core vibes or your core beliefs about what it means to be an effective leader? Now, let me give you a couple of examples to stimulate your thinking. My first instructor in business school was a man named Steve Covey, and he wrote a book called 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. He wrote that many years after I was in his class, and he was still teaching these principles early on as he was formulating his ideas. Notice that he came up with 7, and that all of these, with the exception of number 6, are more than one word. So I invite you not to be just putting down single word principles. Put them in a phrase that describe what you mean. As if you write down integrity, for example, well, that will mean different things to different people depending on who's in the room and what the conversation is, okay? So write out a phrase, what your principles of leadership might be, the Chen principles of leadership or the Liu principles of leadership, and write those down so that we can see them. Now, let me show you a couple other examples. Jack Welch wrote several books with co-authors, one of which was Control Your Destiny or Someone Else Will, and he included not 7 but 6 principles. Control your destiny or someone else will. Face reality as it is, not as it was or as you wish it were, and so forth. So these would be the Welch operating principles. In deference to the founder of my institution, the University of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson also wrote down his 10 principles, probably based on his reading of the Old Testaments. Doesn't have to be 10, doesn't have to be 7, doesn't have to be 6. And notice that you may have on your list a principle that you personally are still struggling with. For example, number 3 on Mr. Jefferson's list was a challenge for him. He went bankrupt twice in his life, living beyond his means for a variety of reasons. So you may have on your list as well some principles that you're still striving to achieve, not necessarily those that you have perfected in your life already. So pause the program now, please, and write down on a piece of paper your personal list of principles that would describe your beliefs about what it means to be an effective leader today. Now, if you've got your list, I wish we had the opportunity to discuss them and to see what you thought about them and what principles you came up with. I mentioned Steve Covey wrote this book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. He made upwards of $90 million a year on those 10 principles, on those 7 principles. For over a decade. His book was on the New York Times bestseller list for 10 years. An extraordinary popularity for those 7 principles. I wonder if you've written a similarly powerful list of principles that you might publish in a book. Well, with those principles in front of you, I'd like to present you with a little episode and see if you can apply those principles to create a leadership result. Do you have any ideas what this might be? Well, this is a rough map of Gettysburg around 1863, which was 2 years into the American Civil War. And on this particular occasion, the Southern Army, under the command of a man named Robert E. Lee, had been extraordinarily successful in those first 2 years. And Robert E. Lee had conferred with the President of the Confederate States of America, the Southern states, and argued that they should invade the North and force Abraham Lincoln, President of the Union, to allow the Southern states to get out or secede. And with Jefferson Davis's approval, Lee organized his army in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia and marched northward into Pennsylvania with somewhere between 70 and 90,000 troops. Now, you can imagine what the reaction was on the northern side. This invasion was going really well because lead elements of the Southern Army under the command of Jubal Early were on this particular day moving in a southerly direction, looking to meet up with the main body under the command of James Longstreet, converging on this hitherto unknown little farming community of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Lincoln was discouraged, and he looked around for the available alternatives and was concerned about that. But he chose a new general. It's the same kind of issue that's going to come up in those organizations that you listed that you might lead someday. Somebody's going to look around and say, we need some new leadership. Whom should we choose? Well, in this particular case, Lincoln chose a man named George Gordon Meade to be in charge of the Union Army, the Northern Army, the Blue Army. And with somewhere between 120 and 130,000 troops, Meade is moving in a northwesterly direction, trying to stay between Lee and Washington, D.C. Well, on this particular day, camped just across the border in Maryland, was the 20th Maine Regiment. Now, a regiment in those days consisted of 1,000 men, boys perhaps, and it was the 20th Maine because there was no draft. They would go to a town, put out a table, call for volunteers, and when they got 1,000 boys, they'd organize a new regiment, give them uniforms and some training, and send them off to war. This had happened in Brunswick, Maine, the previous October. So by the time June 30th came around, 8 months later, the 20th Maine had suffered 70% casualties. There were only 300 of them left. And early in the morning on June 30th, in this little orchard area about here, the 20th Maine is camping, but in the previous battles, all the officers have been killed. So again, they have this issue, we need new leadership, who do we put in charge? So they looked around at the survivors of the 20th Maine Regiment, and they picked a young man who the previous year had been an English teacher at his local community college. He taught history, public speaking, grammar, composition, the typical English curriculum of the day. And because he had an education and seemed to have some moxie, he was put in charge, and they made him a colonel. His name was Joshua Chamberlain. So Chamberlain's been sleeping overnight in one of those white-walled military tents. It's about 5:30 in the morning, and he's trying to get the sleep out of his eyes. He's pulling on his breeches, and he hears a horse galloping down the road toward his tent. As he listens, the horse gets closer and closer until it comes to a screeching halt, rocks and dust flying up against the flaps of his tent, and a voice booms out in the still morning air, orders for Colonel Chamberlain. Well, Chamberlain pokes his head out and he sees this man in a blue uniform astride this lathered up stallion, and who looks down at him and says, "Are you Chamberlain?" "Yes." "I have orders from General Meade." So he jumps down off his horse, reaches into his blouse, hands Chamberlain a piece of paper and says, "We've captured 120 deserters from another Maine regiment. They said they were in for 2 years. The Army said they were in for 3 years. Whatever, they ran. And we captured them, and we've tried to make them fight, but they're stubborn SOBs. They refuse. So now you can think back to our buy-in scale. These 120 deserters on our buy-in scale are at level 7 active resistance, yes? And the courier goes on to explain, well, we've been trying to make them fight. In order to break their spirit, we haven't fed them for 3 days. We've put them in chains. They're stubborn. They still refuse to fight. General Meade knew that you were pulling out this morning, so he's assigned them to your unit. But they were 15 miles away, so in order to get them here before you left, we've been marching them all night long. They'll be here in a few minutes, and General Meade says, you can shoot them if you want to, as deserters, or you can take them with you. But you are not allowed to let them go home. Well, as he's listening to this, Chamberlain looks across the meadow, and he sees a cloud of dust emerging from the woods, 120 men in blue uniforms, and in the still morning air he can hear the clanking of the shackles and the chains. And as he watches, one of the men falls in exhaustion in the borrow pit beside the road, because remember, they haven't eaten in 3 days, they've been marching all night long, they've been up for 36 hours straight, and this guy collapses beside the road. The guard nearest him is poking him and kicking and cursing at him, trying to get him to stand up. He either can't or won't, whereupon the other 119 plop down in the dirt beside him. Now all the guards are upset. They're poking and cursing and kicking. And meanwhile, back at Chamberlain's tent, the courier says, Colonel, do you understand your orders? Well, he looks at the piece of paper he gave him, and it says, Dear Colonel Chamberlain, we have captured 120 deserters from another Maine regiment. We have assigned them to you. With this, you are authorized to execute them if you wish, or you may take them with you, but you are not allowed to let them go home. Signed, sincerely yours, Commander-in-Chief, Army of the Potomac, George Gordon Meade. Chamberlain says, I understand, and the courier gets on his course, rides back to headquarters. Chamberlain says, give my regards to General Meade. And then he's got to decide, as he walks the 100 yards to where they're sitting in the dirt, what he's going to do. What's he going to say? In fact, let me ask you to pause now and write down, think through, what would you say to these deserters? What would be your message? Okay, pause and do that. Now, have you got your answer written down? I can tell you what people from all over the world have done. There are a number of strategies here. Some people will say, okay guys, you either come with me or I'm going to shoot you. How many of you are coming with me? I had one guy from the Czech Republic say, this is really easy. I wouldn't even give a speech. He just walked down, pulled out his gun, and shot the first one and said, how many of the rest of you are coming with me? He got 119 votes, right? Other people say, let's go have breakfast, and then we'll talk about whether or not you're going to come with us as prisoners, or we're going to shoot you, or you come as soldiers. The woman next to him says, no, don't do that. I'm going, why? She says, I'm not going to bury good food in the ground. We're going to decide before breakfast whether you're coming or not. So no last meal for you. If we're going to shoot you, it's going to be on an empty stomach. One woman said, wait a minute, you can go home if you want. You can go home if you want, but if you choose to go home, here are your orders on this piece of paper. Oh yeah, what's on that piece of paper? Well, here are the names of 7 boys who've died in our regiment. Your orders are to go home and visit their moms and dads and explain to them why you've come home and their boys have not. So what was she trying to use? She was trying to use shame, guilt, to make those people do what she wanted them to do. One fellow from Japan came down. He didn't say anything either. He just lined up his 300 men, lock, load, ready, aim, fire, shot all 120 of them. And then he turned to his men and said, "That's what happens to deserters." What would you do? I had one person, I was shocked to see, said, you can come as soldiers or you can come as prisoners. But if you come as prisoners, we're going to put you out in front of our regiment in chains and we're going to march you down the road as a human shield to protect us from the enemy. I thought, oh my gosh. We saw those accounts in recent wars where people have been using women and children as human shields to protect them from combat. Seemed like a sad thing. Well, what Chamberlain did was perhaps a little unusual. We could think about this in terms of maybe a decision diagram. We could say, wait a minute, if we drew a little hexagon here, the first question might be, does this decision match our strategy? Does it fit with what we're trying to accomplish? The second question might be, does it make financial sense? Can we afford to do what I'm trying to do? The third question might be, is it legal? That is, if I pursue this action, am I likely to be prosecuted under the law? We might also ask, is it ethical? That is, given the ethics of this profession or of this situation, am I allowed or permitted to do this thing? We might also ask, is it culturally acceptable given the part of the world in which I am making this decision? And sixthly, we might ask, is this moral? So from my own vabes, my own values and assumptions about the way the world is or should be, can I do the thing that I've just decided? So, we just ask people to describe their principles of leadership, and one person comes down and shoots everybody. Another person threatens to shoot them if they don't come. And typically, by the way, when people say they threaten to shoot them, they tend to get the highest votes, like our Czech friend. He got 119 votes out of the 120 and didn't have to give a big speech. Actions talk louder than words. But what has he really got? Does he have 119 soldiers? Or does he have 119 angry men with guns walking behind him? So think about our outside in, inside out discussion earlier in the course, and also our discussion of the difference between choice and obligation, and what happens when you move from choice to obligation, to productivity, safety, and so forth. Well, if you're familiar with the term fragging, the phenomenon where soldiers will shoot their officers in the back because they don't like the orders they're getting or because they believe obedience is more dangerous than fighting the enemy. Well, our Czech friend maybe has 119 angry men with guns walking behind him, and who knows what's going to happen when they go through a dark, shady place in the road or in the middle of combat when no one's looking. I'll tell you what Chamberlain did as best we can tell. We don't have tape recordings, but we do have multiple accounts taken from various journals and accounts written by people who were there. Chamberlain, as far as one account describes, did something like this. He ordered the guards to take off their shackles. He said, we're slaughtering a steer down in the mess tent. You can go down and have breakfast. And then after you've eaten and I've gotten dressed, we'll get back together and talk. And then he went back to his tent and got dressed. I think this is brilliant. Without any advance warning, with no preparation, he is put in a very difficult situation. And even though it's fairly urgent, they're packing up and getting ready to leave in a few moments, He's going to buy himself just a little time to think about things and clarify his thoughts. He gets dressed, the men have their breakfast, they're all packed up, getting ready to march out, and he says, I've been ordered to take you men with me. I've been told that if you don't come, I can shoot you. I won't do that. Not Maine men. Maybe somebody else will, but I won't. So that's that. This is no time for an argument like this. We're down below half strength, and we need you. There's no doubt of that. So whether you come or not, well, you're all coming. Whether you fight or not is up to you. Right? Leaving them some choice. Now, I don't want to preach to you, he said, but if you choose to fight alongside the rest of us, there's a few things I want you to know. This regiment was formed back last fall, back in Maine, and there were 1,000 of us then, but not 300 now. But what's left is choice. Some of us came in because we were bored at home and it looked like it might be fun. Some came in because we were tired of farming or lumbering. Some came in because we thought it was the right thing to do, or maybe because our friends came in. All of us have seen men die, and most of us have never seen a black man. And we think about that too. Because if you look at history, you'll see that men will fight for various reasons. They'll fight for conquering, for pillage, for land, for women, for jewels, maybe because the king forces them to, or maybe because they just like killing. But this is a different kind of army. This is an army going out to set other men free. This is free ground, all the way from here to the Pacific Ocean. Here we treat you by who you are, not by who your father was. Here's a place you can build a home. Here's a place you can be somebody. Here's a place you can have a family. But it's not the dirt. I never saw dirt that I would die for, and I'm not asking you to come and fight for dirt. Because what we're fighting for in the end is the principle that every man, regardless of color, has value. It's the principle that we're fighting for each other, members of the human race. With that explanation, 116 said yes, 4 said no. They put the 4 back in chains as prisoners, and they marched off down the road. And as it turns out, when they arrived on the field of battle, Chamberlain found himself assigned to the leftmost flank of the Union Army, roughly there. So Longstreet is over here. Early is in the streets and hills behind Gettysburg. And when I've read Chamberlain's journal, and he said when he realized where he was terrified, because he was sure that Longstreet would think if he could attack this leftmost flank, he could turn to the northeast and roll it up like a carpet. And sure enough, on the second day of fighting, Longstreet launched a major attack led by the 15th Alabama Regiment into an area called the Devil's Den. Some of you maybe have been there. And after fierce fighting, Chamberlain realized that he was about to be overrun. So according to military historians, even though he was not trained at West Point, he didn't have any real combat education other than the last 8 months. He did a very unusual thing. He's about out of ammunition, and the Alabamans are charging uphill, and fierce fighting is taking place, and Chamberlain says, load your last bullets, fix bayonets, I guess something no soldier likes to hear, and then he ordered the men to double the distance between each man, extending his line another 100 yards or so to the left. He ordered the men on the right to stand fast, and he ordered the men on the left to charge, creating a huge swinging gate, if you will. And the Alabamans charging uphill, you can imagine the scene, hot, humid weather, the smell of gunpowder in the air, and these 44 and 50 caliber bees and wasps shredding the leaves and branches around you, men screaming out in agony and crying, looked up and saw these big bearded burly lumberjacks charging downhill, didn't realize that they were out of ammunition. Lost nerve, broke ranks, and began to retreat as fast as they could back across to the safety of Seminary Ridge. Well, that night, under the cover of darkness, Pickett came up from the south with an additional 15,000 men and conferred with Lee and Longstreet in a little farmhouse roughly there. And Lee ordered Pickett to charge the center of the Union line the next day. Pickett was opposed to it, Longstreet was opposed to it, but they obeyed. And so those who wrote in their diaries the next day said that it was the most spectacular display of combat precision marching they had ever seen. 15,000 men marching out of the woods with their battle flags waving in the breeze. But the night before, the Union Army had brought cannon up on Little Round Top and Big Round Top here, so that when the Army marched into view, they could engage in what's called enfilading fire, where every shot going down the rows would take out 10 or 12 men instead of 2 or 3. Well, they wiped out Pickett's corps, and that night, under the cover of darkness, Lee organized his retreat back down into Virginia. And historians say that Gettysburg, the Battle of Gettysburg, was the turning point in the American Civil War. Never again was the South strong enough to mount another offensive into the North. It was a matter of time and attrition. They also say that Pickett's charge had no chance, that in fact the battle was won the day before when Joshua Chamberlain held the ground on that little Round Top hill. They also say, by studying the strength of the 15th Alabama and the 20th Maine, if he had had only 300 men, he could not have done it. So those 116 men made the difference. They went from being actively resistant to passionately engaged, willing to risk their lives. And why? What was the difference? Because Chamberlain, at the spur of the moment, without any preparation, was able to articulate, why are we here? What are we trying to accomplish? And how does that relate to you? Now, if you think about it, this was a horrible battle. In 3 days, the casualties equaled the total U.S. casualty list from the entire Vietnam War. If he had lost, if Chamberlain had been overrun, maybe there would be 2 countries where today there is one. And what would have been the impact on World War I, on World War II? Who knows? Maybe somebody else would have stepped up. But we do know that Chamberlain did step up. This is what he looks like. He was wounded 12 times during the war, later promoted to brigadier general. He led the victory parade down Washington's Pennsylvania Avenue at the end of the war, received our country's highest award, the Medal of Honor, and became president of his local community college, Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine, and was twice elected governor. Most Americans have never heard of him or know anything about him, and yet here was a guy. He wasn't the commander-in-chief. He wasn't the chief executive officer. Here was a middle manager way down in the bowels of a very large organization, and his decision on the spot at a particular moment changed the course of American history. So if you think about these various approaches that people all over the world, when I've role-played this situation, have taken. So our Czech friend, the Japanese fellow, many Americans and Europeans and South Americans will play the level 1 card. They'll say, you either come or I shoot you. Maybe they use nice words like, think about the flag. Oh, by the way, but if you don't come, I'll shoot you. So you can open up all that flowery language and look at the package inside, and if the basic deal is the same, we're still looking at a level 1 punishment and reward kind of approach. One might have taken a level 2 approach. Look, our army is half again larger than theirs. We're operating in our own backyard. We have supply lines. They don't. We've got more resources. They don't. We have the advantage here, so logically, from a rational point of view, you should want to come fight with us because, we're going to win this battle. Of course, they've lost the last 4 battles in a row, so maybe this logic would have been non-convincing. But Chamberlain took a level 3 approach. He said, here are the facts. I'm going to explain to you why we're here, and you can choose. Now, the lady who said you can go home if you want, she had 2 big problems, not the least of which was she's disobeyed a flag officer, so she'll probably be court-martialed and hung. And secondly, the 300 men in her regiment are watching this. If she lets the 116 of the 120 go home, why won't they say, hey, what about us? Why can't we go home? So Chamberlain was true to his orders. He didn't disobey his commanding officer, and yet he brought into play that moral part of the decision-making process in which he said, somebody else may shoot you, but I won't, not Maine men. So he went from there. So let me invite you to think about this chart that we've shown a couple of times already. The relationship between level 1 techniques, I think they tend to get you lower levels of buy-in. Level 2 techniques may get you mid-levels of buy-in, and level 3 techniques, in my experience, tend to produce the most passion and engagement. You look around the world and tell me, in your own experience, where do you find people who are passionate, who are completely devoted, who will put what they're doing ahead of family, personal health, personal comfort, vacations, and so forth? Where do you find that kind of activity? And I would argue it's in the not-for-profit activities where people are devoted to a cause. So the challenge, I think, is very similar to the one that you faced in the Chamberlain exercise. In your organization, you're going to have a distribution of performers. You're going to have some people who are operating in a subpar level and some who are extraordinary performers. Let's divide them into 5 groups, the 1s, the 2s, the 3s, which is typically the largest group, the good enough average performers, and the 4s and the 5s. Now, if you look at this and see that what we really want to do is move this distribution to the right. In other words, how do you get the 2s to become 3s, the 3s to become 4s, and the 4s to become 5s? And I think you've got 2 options. One is what I will call traditional leadership technique: planning, organizing, motivating, controlling, setting big, hairy, audacious goals, having periodic performance reviews, and offering rewards and incentives if you reach your goals. I think you can do all of these things till you're blue in the face, and that distribution will not move unless you have what I will call a moral foundation to your attempts to lead. So this comes from an interesting source, actually, the former chief executive officer of the Harley-Davidson motorcycle company, who said that moral leadership is based on 4 principles. Those are truth-telling, promise-keeping, fairness, and respect for the individual. Now, imagine if we put these 4 principles on a scale where 0 means never and 100 means always, and 50% would mean half of the time. If you told your people the truth half of the time, would they follow you? If you kept your promises to your employees, to your followers, half of the time, would they follow you? If you treated them fairly half of the time, would they follow you? If you showed respect for your followers half of the time? Would they follow you? I've asked those questions all over the world, and uniformly the answers come back no. So if you accept the premise that 50% isn't good enough, I think you could agree that if you don't get Olympic gold medal numbers, 9.9, 9.8, 9.7, 9.9, on those four dimensions, you won't get high levels of buy-in from the people in your organization. Now, there's an exercise in the back of the Level 3 Leadership book, you could create one yourself, where you would list these four principles, distribute them to your people, have your administrative assistant collect the data, you do your assessment of what you think the team is going to say, and then you have your assistant average up the scores of all of the people you've distributed this to anonymously. And if you come back and find that you say 9.9, 9.8, 9.7, 9.9, and they come back with 4.6, 6.5, 5.2, 6.4, you can see that you've got a much bigger problem than putting out incentives, than offering free vacations, trying to improve productivity. You've got a moral gap in your attempts to lead others, and they're not likely to follow you. So I think Chamberlain exemplifies 6 steps to effective leadership. These include clarifying your center. In other words, someone else may kill you, but I will not. My moral core, my vabes, do not permit me to shoot you. Now, when I asked you earlier in this segment to list your personal principles of leadership, I wonder how that matched up with your proposed behavior when I asked you how you would handle Chamberlain's dilemma. If you went back and looked at what you did and compared that with what you said earlier about what your core principles were, is there a good fit? In Chamberlain's case, he said, I am not going to shoot you. Somebody else might, but I will not. So clarifying your center, what you would and would not do, is an important part of effective leadership. Clarifying what's possible. Chamberlain was able to describe why we're fighting this war. It's not about conquering. It's not about pillage. It's not about rape and grabbing land. This is about setting other people free and maintaining the integrity of a nation. So if you can't describe that without notes, without a laminated card, with the strength of your own beliefs, then you may not be able to get other people to respond. Clarifying what others can contribute. What's your role in this? How could you see a part in what we're trying to accomplish? So this is akin, I think, to maybe you remember John F. Kennedy's famous dictum in his inaugural address, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. In other words, instead of being a taker, think about what you can contribute, and that, by implication, means that every person has something to add. They have value. And regardless of how they look, regardless of where they came from, if they're contributing, they're a net builder rather than a net destroyer. Supporting others so they can contribute, we'll give you some food, we'll give you some weapons, we'll give you some boots. Never giving up. Chamberlain was wounded 12 times during the war, being relentless in pursuit of the vision which he saw, and then celebrating progress along the way. So if we map this onto our diamond model, clarifying your center has to do with who are you. Clarifying what's possible has to do with what's your story. Clarifying what others can contribute has to do with selling your story. And supporting others so they can contribute has to do with organizational, feeding them meals, giving them weapons, providing the necessary assets to accomplish the purpose, never giving up, and then celebrating and measuring progress with short-term operating goals along the way. So I invite you to think about level 3 alternatives when you're confronted with the idea of how do I motivate my people. Am I going to use level 1 techniques, offer them more bonuses and rewards, the assumption being that people will do anything for money? At what level of buy-in? When does it become compliant and apathetic, or even passively or actively resistant? What about level 2 techniques? Should I use logic and data? Or, as Chamberlain gave us an example, could I use level 3 techniques? Maybe I don't have clarity about our purpose and mission or our vision in mind. And if that's the case, then I would argue as a leader, you need to do your homework so that you can make those level 3 arguments in the absence of someone else doing it. You can bring clarity out of confusion if you understand how to do it.